Hello everyone, I'm William. I'm one of the training officers alongside Robert this year for the SSDC. Um, Currently at St Andrews, helping with competitions. Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about prep time today. So this is aimed at those that are just starting their journey in BP or those that perhaps want to brush up on some of their skills of prep. So before we go on to discuss about prep, it's just important to recognize whether or not this is going to be useful to you. Recognize that preparation or prep time, the 15 minutes that you usually get before the start of a debate, is a very critical point of the debate. I.e., this is usually where debates are won and lost with you and your partner, is whether or not you're using these 15 minutes to the best and to the advantage of both of yourselves. Some common signs that you maybe have problems with prep is if, for instance, you get judges that tell you that there is disunity between you and your partner. You may are talking about different things. You don't seem to have a common line or a common strategy. Second, if you often find, particularly if you're OG, that judges and other teams call you out for falling out of the debate, which means that you're not as relevant as you should be because the debate moves away from you. Or perhaps if you find your case is just not often being credited, they're often being dismissed. These are probably three indications that maybe there is something going wrong with your prep. And hopefully after this, maybe those will be less likely to be going wrong. So the stuff we're going to talk about, mainly just for beginners, what is the point of prep time? Why are we getting 15 minutes to discuss a motion before we debate it? I'm going to talk a little bit about some strategies that I would suggest, or at least I use sometimes in prep time, and then some drills. So some things that you can try on your own time if you're keen, or if you have other friends in your debating society and you just want to try these out rather than just running a debate over and over again, because it can be quite useful to just build up skills rather than just practice debating over and over again. So what is the goal of prep? So some things you want to be thinking about in prep, and some things you will see if you look at other very good prep videos on YouTube, is a myriad of these keywords, things like arguments, things like clashes, reasoning, etc. So in BP, you will end up getting 15 minutes after a motion is released to try to prep that motion, i.e. come up with some arguments, come up with some sort of structure, getting ready to deliver a speech. Recognize that, particularly in British parliamentary debating, you will only know your speaking position. You can't access things like the internet or a debate partner other than your own. So only you and somebody else can talk about the motion, can prep arguments. After that 15 minutes, you're expected to go into a debate. If you're like the OG team, one of you will just get up and start speaking, and so on and so forth. So the goal of prep is therefore to come up with an argument, but more than just that, is to understand and predict what is going to happen in that debate before you start to speak. Because if you're able to nail down what is likely to happen in the debate before you start, this gives you the best way in order to understand what you'll have to say and what you should say in order to win. I presume your goal here is to win. If your goal is to have fun, I'm not sure why you're watching these videos, to be honest with you. You know, agency, etc. I put dunking in here because that might be the other reason why you like debating, like myself, although I don't get to dunk as often as I would like. So some questions that you should have during prep time. So these are the fundamental questions that you probably want to be thinking about within the first 30 seconds of seeing a motion. Now, because we've luckily transitioned out of COVID lockdowns, you no longer use online, so it's usually in-person debating. This is probably the kind of thing you want to be thinking about as you're moving towards the room after you leave the announcements hall. So you want to be thinking about definitions, i.e. what is this motion actually about, using the keywords like this house would, this house believes, just clarifying that you know what this is. Understanding just your position. This might sound quite trivial, but I have more than once fallen into the trap of prepping a motion whilst being in the incorrect position. Also notice, I think, in the Oxford IV final last year, the team in OO thought they were in OG, so and then didn't obviously give a proposition speak, but confessed in DLO that this has happened. So it's not just a thing that happens with beginner debaters, it happens to all of us. You also want to be thinking about fundamentally what the purpose of the debate is. So as you're walking to that room, why have the CA set this motion? Why are we talking about this? Etc. So here's an example of what I mean. So let's say you and I are debating partners. The motion for the round we're about to debate is this House believes the feminist movement should oppose the commercialization of reproduction, for example, the sale of ova. So we think about those three questions then. So what is the definition here? So we understand that a part of this motion is focusing on the feminist movement. we are talking about whether or not the feminist movement should oppose something. And the thing we are thinking about whether or not we should oppose, well, not as an actor, but as the feminist movement should oppose, is commercialization. So you want to be thinking about, okay, do I know generally what I mean by feminist movement? Do I generally know what I mean by oppose? And do I generally know what I mean by commercialization? This point is useful because obviously for anyone, if you just look and think about this motion for a minute or so, you'll recognize that teams are probably likely going to disagree about what the feminist movement is and probably what commercialization is. And therefore, by you just looking and reading the motion, you can start to think about some ways in which teams are going to disagree with each other. Position, just reflecting on your mind, did you look at the draw? Are you gov or you op? So if you're a government, you'd be giving reasons why the feminist movement probably should oppose. If you're opposition, you're going to give some reasons why you think they shouldn't oppose. Be very careful that sometimes some motions annoyingly have double negatives. So you might see like this house believes the feminist movement shouldn't oppose, which I don't know why people do this, but it sometimes happens and it's very confusing. So the purpose of the debate is probably the last thing you want to question. This links to definitions, right? So you might want to start thinking about, well, what kind of arguments can I make about what the feminist movement should or shouldn't do, or what I should tell our judges the feminist movement should or shouldn't do. Think about some things like the values of the feminist movement, or just maybe some ways people think about the selling your ova or the contents of your biological reproduction. And this can prime you to start to think about some of the ideas you want to talk about. After you've started that, this is like the first 30 seconds, you know the basics of what is going on in the debate, and hopefully this is the point where you might ask your other partner, just like a quick 3 seconds, do we agree that we're gov? Do we agree that the word oppose exists, or do we agree that this is probably the thing that's going to happen in the debate? This can be very useful, so that you don't spend like 5 minutes in prep disagreeing about each other. Disagreeing with each other about what the point of this debate is, because it's just really annoying when it happens. So after that, you want to have a few minutes to just think about the case. So this is what we call silent prep, where you don't necessarily just splurge all your ideas to your partner. You want to just take a minute or two to just reflect on what the motion is about. So some things you might want to be thinking of as clashes. So clashes is just what it says on the tin, kind of an esoteric tin. What are teams disagreeing about, i.e., government team might argue X. What are arguments or what responses will opposition team Y in, i.e. what they're going to disagree about. Metrics, i.e. is it possible in the debate that some teams will argue some things are important, whereas some other teams will argue other things are important? If you're able to get a taste of what you can expect the different metrics to be in a debate, this can help you to understand, especially if you're closing, the diversity of other arguments that may exist in the debate. But also if you're thinking a little bit more advanced, what kind of things do you want to think about preemptively to try to knock out a metric? And then reasons, i.e. reasons that one clash is more important than the other, or reasons we should care about one actor rather than the other. Think about all of these things, builds a case that is likely, as you can see in the meme, is likely going to probably give you a good chance of winning the debate. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean, not abstractly. So we take the motion we saw earlier. First question you need to think about clashes in a prep session on your own is to think, what are teams likely to disagree about here? So one idea might be just the aims of the feminist movement. So government teams might argue the reason the feminist movement should oppose this is because they shouldn't allow for the exploitation of women's biological nature for the purpose of money, i.e. they may argue that the commercialization of reproduction will fundamentally, as per the info slide, result in women selling their egg cells, and this may be somewhat exploitative and against the overall narrative of the feminist movement. In contrast, opposition may argue the purpose of the feminist movement is to allow female autonomy, and therefore you shouldn't oppose an action that presumably allows a woman to use her own rights and her own biology to the benefit of herself, i.e. getting money and all of the stuff that comes with that. So here we see a fundamental clash about what the purpose of the feminist movement should be. Should it be to restrict agency of women for certain higher order goals, or could it be to always not restrict agency because agency to women is the most important thing? So you can see here's some ideas about what teams may disagree about, specifically around the keyword of the feminist movement. Something else is linked to that is there may be a more meta disagreement about the role to which the feminist movement should play in the intervention of other people's lives. This can become quite complex, but there's probably something teams are likely going to disagree about in at least some layer of abstraction. A third is just the consequences of this. Teams are likely to disagree about how people react to this. If people hate this and may leave the feminist movement, or people are going to love this and join the feminist movement. If right-wing media is going to hate this, or whatever the benefits are. Most, if not all, debates have this degree of consequential disagreement, where teams disagree about the likely result of this motion. So you want to try to think about the spectrum of different arguments that are likely to emerge here. And then linked to that, how does this play out in the real world? This is different from consequences. This is thinking about the reasons to which things happen, i.e., if one argument a team might think is a consequence is that the feminist movement ends up losing people from the movement because they get annoyed at the fact they're losing the feminist movement is telling them to do something they would otherwise, the feminist movement is telling women to do what they otherwise would want to do. You might think that this results in people leaving the movement. Like, there's going to be disagreements about why that is likely, or the scale to which this is going to happen, or the permanency, like is this going to be a short-term impact versus a long-term impact? So these are all different ways you can think about the disagreements that are going to exist in debate. So after you've thought about disagreements, i.e. clashes, another thing to maybe think about in the first 2-3 minutes of a debate, of a prep session, is metrics. So these are, teams sometimes don't necessarily disagree about the fundamentals of a motion, or like the fundamentals of the consequence, but they may disagree about which of the consequences is the most important, i.e. the consequences that befall the feminist movement as a body. Some teams may argue is more important than how women feel about the feminist movement or how society views the feminist movement in their previous example. By understanding that and appreciating that these disagreements are valid, as in these metrics are valid things that can exist in the debate, and maybe just listing them or thinking about them means that you can understand the complexities of the debate you're likely going to be stepped into. Recognize that all too often, particularly if it's round one, you're stepping into a room that's random, and you may be, if you have thought about this, you may be in a unique position to provide that layer of nuance and complexity to a debate that a judge may appreciate and think is quite sophisticated, and may therefore, by just virtue of you thinking about this, stand you in a far better tide. Secondly, it probably just means that you're not caught off guard as much, because now you kind of know what your other team is going to argue, you know what your top table may disagree about, and thirdly, you know the minutiae of the different things you may want to talk about if you're an extension speaker, for instance. So let's take a different example. So let's say you have this house believes hiring paid protesters is a legitimate way to promote a cause. So let's think about some metrics here. So what are teams likely to think is more or less important? So for instance, some teams may focus on the effect to the paid actor themselves, whether or not it's legitimate to have the consequences befall them. They may feel, guilty. They may get like backlash on social media, whatever. They may just feel bad in it themselves. Are these consequences that befall them the most important thing that happens in the debate? Other teams may argue it's the way in which people who are the victims of a cause get treated by society as a consequence. So you can see that this is two layers of disagreement, right? You have a clash here, which is probably likely the consequences of this motion, whether or not hiring paid protesters does result in a degree of backlash that makes individuals respond negatively, and whether the negative response is the sufficient analysis is going to be illegitimate. And also metric clashes, in which actors are important, why they are important. Thinking about these two things, you don't need to have an exhaustive list in the first 2 minutes, especially if you're opening, you don't want to spend too long, you don't want to spend half your prep thinking about all the different metrics, because obviously you have to write a speech. But being able to get a good understanding of what probably is the most intuitive arguments for metrics, the most intuitive clashes, means that you can construct a speech and opening that is quite strong. And these are kind of things also you may also, if you're closing, wish to focus on more. This obviously you need to be a bit more inventive in a closing position. And think about a array of different metrics may just make your extension speeches less stressful, let's say. So debating, therefore, is all about basically just resolving this, right? You're going into a debate with 3 other teams that are going to try to beat you in different ways. They're going to try to disagree with you in a minutiae, and a plethora, and a smorgasbord of different ways. The job of a winning team is to resolve this disagreement as much as possible, both fundamentally analytically, so using reasoning rather than just like saying you're wrong, which sometimes does happen in a debate, but it doesn't get you anywhere. Well, actually, anyway, it shouldn't get you anywhere. if you're able to be very good at understanding the different metrics of debate and clashes and prep, you're more than able, when you get into debate, to breeze off all of the disagreements because you're not fazed by them. You've already thought about them for 15 minutes, and therefore you can just like be a cool cucumber and solve this, obviously. So basics then. So what have we talked about then? So in prep time, you're going to have some questions. You're going to maybe spend the first 30 seconds of prep thinking about definitions. What is this motion asking me to do? Why was it set? The position I am, and then indeed the purpose of the debate. I'm going to move to think about in the next minute those clashes, so the disagreements that are likely to emerge in the debate. What are teams going to disagree about? Why are they going to disagree about them? What are the different alternatives of things like metrics or actors? And then we come to arguments, which is where you spend the rest of the prep, now that you're fully primed, knowing what the disagreements are, to best exploit the disagreements that are likely to emerge, to create a case that is going to resolve as many of those potential conflicts as possible towards your side. So let's look at that. Naturally, argument generation is not something I can teach you in abstract, i.e. I can't give you a tool that will fundamentally mean that you know every good argument in every possible debate you'll ever see. But here's the kind of things questions you want to ask yourself, and these are the kind of things you want to train yourself on. So after understanding the reasons that a debate is set, you're ready for case construction. So I think case construction has 3 areas. One, it just starts with an idea, and this is where you want to be as intellectually honest as possible. I think this is where having a good partnership works, is if you're not scared to create some wacky ideas and have a bit of faith in your partner's not going to laugh at you as a result. So you want to think about, okay, if the judge only had 5 seconds to listen to me, and I only could outline an argument in 5 seconds, what is like the headline that I want them to take away with? Like, what is the thing I want to prove in the debate? And what is the thing I need to prove in the debate in order to win? After you have that general idea, and both your people and your prep agree with that, now you want to be thinking about, okay, how do I prove that that is true, and prove that that is important? This is what we call burdens. So what needs to be true for my idea to actually make sense and to be agreed by a majority of individuals who are not just going to agree with it on face value? Because recognize, as you may have seen in Ewan's video, and if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. It's a very good introduction to the judging. Judges are trying to resolve debates analytically, not just on their emotion or rhetoric, but what can they actually follow the logic to what you're arguing. So after you think about what I need to prove what I need to say in order to prove my point, you want to think about something called a comparative. So obviously debates are constructed such that either side can make pretty compelling arguments and win the debate. When you start to get into medium tier rooms, let's say you got a first in round 1 and you end up in a good room in round 2, all teams there therefore have demonstrated their capacity to come up with a good idea and to prove a good idea. Now the skill is to prove that your idea is better than somebody else's idea. So this involves a diversity of different skills, right? Things like rebuttal and things we're not going to talk about today. But in prep, what you can do once you have your idea is to integrate some of the ideas of metrics and clashes you thought about earlier. I.e., why is our argument really important or the most important in the debate? Why is it likely to be more important than maybe another metric that I think another team may argue? And this is where you can be preemptive in Gov, but you can also use your prep to list arguments and use 2 minds rather than just an extension speaker's mind to think about some reasons to why one metric that you're arguing is going to be more important than potentially an openings metric that you thought about in prep. These are all things that are built with practice, and getting into the structure is at least the first step. So an example, let's say we have the motion. This House believes developing countries should adopt English as the primary language of instruction in schools. Let's say you've thought about clashes. So you thought about definitions here. You know what a developing country is, probably one that is developing, i.e. somewhat poverty, or maybe fragility of democratic institutions. Adopting, i.e. integrate, and yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory. And then primary language is in the language that is predominantly taught, probably accepting that this is not the only language they'll be taught, and then knowing it's in schools. Clash points are likely to be the consequences of this for people in that country. The metrics may be things like the children that are going to be experiencing this, the countries, the people who are competing against jobs, or just the inherent aspect, acquisition of culture, all of those things. Let's say one of the ideas you have in government is maybe this is a good idea because it helps social mobility, i.e. people in developing countries can therefore access English and therefore potentially use that language to get very high-paying jobs that these developed nations, particularly England and those that are English-speaking, can provide. So this is probably a good idea. It sounds like a good argument. If you're able to prove this, probably would stand you quite well in the debate. So what kind of things do you need to prove? What are your burdens? So here are two examples. First thing you're probably going to want to ask is, why is my ability to learn English, or at least if I'm in a developing country, why do I have to learn English in order to access these well-paying jobs, right? Like, why can't I just access well-paying jobs using my own native language? Or why couldn't I learn English outside of school if I was growing up in this country? There's some reasons you can think about that, right? Maybe it's just comparatively easier to learn English if you're being taught English. If young people are being taught it as opposed to when they're older, it stores in their mind longer, all of these reasons. Second burden that you probably need to prove is, like, why is this a route to social mobility? As in, why is the acquisition of money in this way a route to social mobility, i.e. the progression to become more stable in your life, to become better educated, to have a higher paying job so that you can have a more stable life? Like, why is that true? After thinking about burdens, you want to think about comparative, right? So other teams may just choose different metrics. They may argue, no, social mobility isn't as important as the individual's appreciation of their own culture, or the development of industries within a nation would be deprived by people speaking English and leaving the country, for instance. So these are metrics that teams are going to disagree about, and therefore you can preempt this by trying to think of some reasons why social mobility is really important. Some ideas here may be, it's just easier this way of social mobility. It is undeniable that this is something that you have to compete against, and therefore you may as well just go with the current, whatever. Let's think about the opposite side, right? Let's say you're opposition, and you think, oh no, wait, the argument I want to make is, this is likely going to lose an individual, especially a young person, so the next generation's access to things like indigenous cultures, the culture of the land, and the history of that land, and all of that kind of stuff. What are your burdens here then? You have similar burdens, but a little bit different. One is to appreciate basically the definitions of the motion, is to prove why, if I adopt English as a primary but not an not a sole language, why this means I'm somehow disconnected from my culture. Part of this might just be describing what kind of culture you're talking about and why maybe you can't understand history through a lens of a different language. It's often the case that language, within its own construction, imbues a user with meaning that they can't fully understand, even if they try to learn that language later on. A classic example is this, is that there are common words in German to express emotions that aren't in English, like Schadenfreude, that maybe, even though I know what that word means, as in the pleasure looking at other people suffering, maybe I understand that on the intellectual level. Maybe there's a more visceral aspect of that knowing that about emotion. Another example is things like Greek. Like, Greek has many different words for love, whereas we only have one word for love in English, basically. We say, I love my parents, I love my girlfriend, I love my dog. We mean probably different things. We feel as if there are different emotions there, but that word does not translate that. I'm going into analysis here, but this is just one argument. Or one burden to think of. Second burden is maybe why, even if it's true that adopting English is a way that disconnects young people from their culture, why is it only if English is taught in the school, tying it back to the second part of that motion, why that is the unique way in which you end up losing your culture? Think about those kind of questions, right? Another way to think about this is you and your partner can act as just general debaters, where you're like, okay, you try to pick holes in the argument here. So maybe one of your members presents this idea, and you try to ask some questions you would have if you had just heard this conversation in a pub. Like, well, why does indigenous culture matter? Why is English the only way to access indigenous culture? Why should I care about this, right? These are kind of questions you want to be asking each other in prep. It's important not to get into the rope of just asking the questions without providing the answers. You want to both be providing and thinking of these answers. And obviously recognizing the comparative here. So why is the loss of indigenous culture important in relation to other things that other teams may argue? Like, for instance, what Proposition argued in the previous slide about social mobility. Obviously, this is a lot of things to think about in 15 minutes, and this is definitely a skill that does not come easy, and it comes with time. But recognize the transferability of the skill as well. Being able to think about ideas in a very versatile and dynamic manner is probably a very good just general skill to have as a critical thinker, but probably just makes you more competent and confident with arguing cases in the world, right? So, a lot of content, but recognize that prep time, especially if you're new to debating, it's important to recognize the importance of prep time, i.e. it is where debates are won and lost. This stuff takes practice and commitment. Don't, at the end of this workshop, think, oh, I'm so overwhelmed, this was useless. It probably is overwhelming, but it probably isn't useless. as in you can integrate this framework into your own practice and maybe your own training if you're involved in debating, or perhaps this being a reason to why you want to join debating. Recognize that prep time involves obviously using your time very effectively. When you have 15 minutes, you need to be very conscious of how much time you have and want to focus not just on listing loads of arguments, but really just think about the disagreements teams are going to have. You should trust yourself even if you have no arguments to enter prep. If you understand the disagreements, you're probably just able to listen to what other people are saying and just stand up and respond. Like, speeches don't necessarily have to be 7 minutes, and you don't necessarily have to speak at like 10,000 miles an hour. If you're able just to come up with one good point relative to a disagreement that you thought about for 15 minutes, that is probably really enough most of the time, especially if you're new to debating. Also think about the way teams will disagree with each other, things like actors, metrics, blah, blah, blah. When constructing an argument in prep, which is probably something you may want to do, may feel more confident in doing, as in most people don't like going into debating without at least some semblance of what they're going to argue. Think about when you're trying to create a headline, what do I need to be true to convince a judge that my headline, social mobility existing in the example previously, is true, providing some reasons why that is by thinking about what do I need to prove, i.e. if I were listening to myself, what questions would I ask myself in order to disprove me? And then obviously think about what we call a comparator. So why is what I'm telling you more important than what the 3 other probably very competent and very intellectual teams are also going to try to convince them? Because it's important to recognize that in debating, you shouldn't underestimate your opponents. They have also had 15 minutes. They also probably know the topic as well as you do, and probably can come up with some good arguments as well. So you want to be thinking about responses to their arguments preemptively in prep. So hopefully that was useful. If you have any questions, comment section, I will hopefully answer them. Yeah, hopefully this is useful. See you at the Scottish competition or some other debating competition, and sometime soon. See ya.